the seven churches, this truly is amazing messages that Jesus is presenting for us. I'll let you know today that we're not going to make it through Smyrna. We talked about Ephesus last time, the fact that Ephesus needed to fire up, and the reason they needed to fire up is because they'd left their first love. The Lord lists their praises there. They were hard workers. They endured. They rejected evil. They persevered. However, he says that they'd forgotten their first love, and he says they need to remember from where they had fallen. They need to repent, and they need to do the deeds that they did at first. And if they did that, they would have access to the tree of life. And if they did not do that, that their lampstand would be removed. And that's what we looked at last time. Now we move on to another body, the church in the city of Smyrna, and here's what we read about it. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your affliction and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. There's the location of Smyrna. You notice that it's in the proximity of Ephesus as well. Smyrna was an ancient, wealthy city. It was a seaport. It was an important Roman city of the time. Emperor worship was one of the central activities in this city, even though there was a temple to Athena that was here as well. Smyrna had a large population of Jewish people. Many Jews cooperated with the city, and especially in their persecution of Christians. What we read there in verse 9 is that there were those who claimed to be Jews who were actually, Jesus calls them, of the synagogue of Satan. Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum are main cities that this area of Asia, and almost there was a competition almost between all of them to see, which city was the most important and the most significant. So you kind of get this Husker pride thing going for all these ancient cities here as well. The strength that we're going to notice today that Jesus identifies among the saints at Smyrna, he says this, that they were enduring suffering, that they had deep poverty, yet they were rich. So as we think about what is said here, I want to begin by just noting this. When Jesus begins this address to Smyrna, he says, I want you to write this, but then he references himself as the one who is the first and the last, the one who has died and who has come back to life. I think that's noteworthy because what is going to be addressed to the church at Smyrna primarily focuses on a tremendous persecution. And here is Jesus identifying, I'm the first and the last. I'm the whole. But not only am I the whole, I'm also the one who was put to death, but I came to life again. And I think what Christ is trying to do is to let them know, if you want to talk about persecution, I'm the king. There's more that's happened to me that's ever happened to any other human being. Yet, I am complete. Yet, I was raised from the dead. So I think it validates what he's going to say when he references himself in those terms. I think that's what he was trying to do. In verse 9, the address begins by Jesus telling the Christians at Smyrna, I know your affliction. I know your afflictions. Do you find it comforting that Jesus is aware of our afflictions? He knows our hurts. He knows our persecutions. He understands those things. It's interesting because this is written after Jesus has ascended into heaven, probably been gone from earth up to 70 years by this time, and he's writing to a church and saying, I know your afflictions. A resurrected Jesus at the right hand of God knows your afflictions, folks, and that should bring a certain level of peace. And here's Jesus telling the Christians at Smyrna, I know your afflictions. The Greek word here for afflictions is thalopsis, and it has to do with, carries the idea of pressure. So what Jesus is saying is, I know the pressure that you are under. But let's kind of look at the anatomy of this word as it built and grew through the years. It actually developed from the word tribos, which means a rut or a worn track. Another word that contributed to its meaning is the word thilbo, and it means to crowd. So when we put this entire word and its history together, what we come up with is that affliction is a pressure that tries to crowd out something, and it does it so consistently and so often so as to create a rut. An actual physical example of this would be an olive press in these ancient times, because it was designed to exert pressure that would separate the oil from the olive. And it was accomplished in such a way as to continually wear a rut, to wear down. And here's an example of an olive press. And so you see the idea of affliction is the idea of being under a tremendous weight that's trying to crowd something out of us, and it doing it consistently, over and over, around and around again. Jesus, when he writes the Christians, says, I know the pressure that you are under. The affliction then at Smyrna was determined and deliberate. It was brutal opposition. It involved physical torture, even to the point, the text lets us know, that some would lose their life. You've heard the name Polycarp before. We've talked about him actually before. This time, however, I found some things relative to his execution that I had not found before. So I want to share them with you. I wasn't there, so I can't validate this. My guess is most of these kinds of things develop around tradition, something that gets read and people expound upon it. So I can't say this is 100% accurate, but some of it is because it's verifiable. The date is February 23rd, 155 AD. His name is Polycarp. He was an elder at the church at Smyrna. As a young man, he'd been a disciple of the Apostle John, but he was no longer young. He was 86 years old. Through the years, the Christians of Smyrna had come under persecutors, and this time it was no different. Public opinion had been stirred against the church, and specifically against one of the leaders of the church, Polycarp. The cry went out from the crowd that Polycarp be executed. The story goes that when the Roman troops arrived at his home, he requested that they allow him 1 hour to engage in prayer. As he left to pray, he left instructions for his family to provide the best of their food and drink as the soldiers waited. Eventually, he's taken to the Roman governor, where he's confronted and asked to deny Christ. He says, if you deny Christ, I will let you go. Polycarp just looked at him and said, deny Christ? I have served him 86 years, and in no way has he dealt unjustly with me. So how can I now blaspheme my king who saves me? The governor tried again. Act your age and wisdom. Praise Caesar. Change your mind. Say, away with the theist. Polycarp looked at the pagans surrounding him, waved his hand as he replied, away with the atheists. Not exactly the response the governor was hoping for. Then Polycarp said, if you vainly expect that I will swear by Caesar's genius, as you suggest, and pretend to be ignorant of who I am, listen to what I say to everyone here. I am a Christian. If you want to learn the teaching of Christianity, name the day and hear about our beliefs. That was all that was needed. Don't you realize that I can have you thrown to the wild beast? Polycarp said, go ahead. Well, he obviously wasn't afraid of the quick death by animals. Maybe he would fear slow torture. How about I burn you alive? Go ahead. He was led to the platform where the execution was to take place. Normally, the prisoners would be nailed to the stake to secure them in place. But as they approached Polycarp with hammer and nails, he said, "Let me be as I am. For he who makes it possible for me to endure the fire will also make it possible for me to remain unmoved without the security of your nails." And he did. So on February 23rd, all those years ago, an elder from the church at Smyrna became a martyr. One can only wonder if the very words that we have read today were what gave Polycarp the stamina and the faith to go to meet his Savior in that fashion. I know your affliction. But not only does Jesus let that body of Christians know that he understands their affliction, he also says, I know your poverty. There are actually two words in the Greek language that are sometimes translated and relate to the subject of poverty. The first one has to do with just being in need, just the basic needs being met, hand-to-mouth kind of thing. But the second word that is used is the word that would indicate the most destitute condition possible. It would be the word that would be applied to beggars of the first century, beggars who had no means of income, whose only means of existence would be to be on a street and to beg for enough sustenance to sustain their life. That's the word that appears here. Jesus says, I know your deep poverty. Now, add to that the fact that at this time, there was actual legislation passed by the Roman government because as it began to torture Christians, it said it's illegal for you to sell anything to a Christian. It also became illegal to purchase anything from a Christian. Now, folks, just think about that for a bit. You want to describe deep poverty? That's what it is. You can't sell anything that you have to sell. Anything you manufacture, anything you grow, you can't sell. But not only can you not sell, if you were one who had something to, had the ability to purchase, you could not buy anything. So you couldn't sell anything, you couldn't buy anything. Jesus says, I know your poverty. But then he throws in, but you are rich. But you are rich. The idea of this, the Greek word here means you are wealthy, you are abounding with. It's from a word that means fullness or value. It's from pletho as an ultimate root, which means to be filled. Jesus said, I know your affliction, I know your deep poverty, that you have no means to buy anything, you have nothing to sell, yet you're rich, you're full, you're complete, you are filled. What's he talking about? Not talking about stuff, is he? He's talking about what's in here. He's talking about their spirit. He's talking about their life spiritually. He says, even though physically you are hurting from affliction, you are in poverty, yet you are rich. And then Jesus says, I know the slander. And we talked about that subject a few weeks back. This slander was coming upon the early church at Smyrna. And Jesus says, I know that you're being slandered. With the large Jewish population that was trying to tie itself in with the Roman government, this all became a tremendous persecution against that early body of Christians. The Jews were engaging in these slanderous activities because, you remember early on, Christianity was merely perceived as a sect of Judaism. And now they're wanting to make a distinction. This is not anything like us. So the twisted, distorted, and false accusations that are specifically being leveled against the church and their beliefs and their practices, Jesus says, I know those things. I know what's being said about you. I know the slanderous activity. from people who call themselves Jews of the synagogue, but they just belong to Satan. William Barclay outlines 5 different things that the early church would have been persecuted for here in Smyrna. He suggests, first of all, that the Lord's Supper would have been a practice around which slanderous words would have been spoken. Because as we come to that Lord's Supper, we partake of bread and fruit of the vine that represent what? Body and blood. Now, it wouldn't take much of a distortion to have this group of Christians be cannibalistic. Every Sunday they come together, and what are they doing? They're talking about eating bodies and eating blood. And that kind of slanderous activity, according to Barclay, was being leveled against this congregation in Smyrna. The tremendous emphasis on love, loving each other, being one and caring about each other, could easily be distorted by turning love into lust. Number 3, conversion often created, even as it does today, religious divisions within families. And so it would be easy for Jews to slander the Christians as being a group who was against family, who was dividing families, who was upsetting the very essence of God's original institution, the family. And they could level that and say that these Christians are just about dividing families. Fourthly, their belief in a single God, Jehovah, could be a point that could be slandered. In a pagan society where multiple gods were worshipped, a group who had selected one it could be leveled against them, that they think they're better than all the others, etc. And then number 5, since Christians accepted Jesus as their Lord, their allegiance was to his lordship and not to that of Caesar, as we just illustrated with the words of Polycarp. And so it would be easy to level the accusation, falsely so, against these early Christians that they were anti-government. They were against Rome. Nero, you'll remember, even used Christians as the scapegoat for the fire that destroyed most of Rome. So they're anti-political people. They're against the government. Those are 5 things that William Barclay suggests that could be leveled slanderously against the Smyrna church. As we read the tremendous faithfulness of this body of believers, I think there's a number of things that need to impress us. Number 1 is we need to be impressed with their devotion. We also, I think, need to understand that their commitment to spiritual things was so powerful that they endured all kinds of affliction, they endured deep poverty and slanderous things being spoken about them, and yet they remained committed. You know, and I think, I'll just throw this in as a freebie. We need not get all wrapped up in all this political talk concerning America. The king is still the king. And whether we live here or whether we live in Africa or whether we live in Syria or wherever we live, the king is still the king. And we need to do what we can do as Christian citizens of this nation. But our number 1 concern is not who's in the White House. Our number 1 concern is who's in this house. And it needs to be Jesus. And we learned that from Smyrna, because they're being accused of being against certain political things. They're having all these things said about them. So there's a number of things that we can process about this. I need to tell you that as I was working on this lesson, I could not get a song out of my head. And sometimes that happens to me. And so it just cycles and it just cycles and it cycles. And the song that kept coming into my head was the song, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. So I got curious and did a little research into the song itself. Written in 1922. The author of this song, Helen, she wrote the song based upon a track of a friend of hers. Helen was obviously a musician, that's why she wrote the words and the music. The friend of hers was an artist at the turn of the 20th century, and she was a very good artist. You know, we hear about struggling artists. This gal was a wealthy artist. She never struggled. So she was a very well-to-do artist who decided that she needed to do something spiritual. So she devoted herself to become a missionary and went to Algeria, and she was a missionary for 38 years working amongst the Muslims there. And she wrote, she was also a writer, and she wrote some tracts. And Helen read one of the tracts, and it became the inspiration for the song. So here are some words from that track. Never has it been so easy to live in half a dozen harmless worlds at once. Art, music, social science, games, motoring, the following of some profession, and so on. In other words, she says, we've got all this stuff going on, and there's never been a time when we could divide ourselves among so many good things. But then she says this, and between them, we run the risk of drifting about, the good hiding the best. And then she goes on in this tract and talks about the fact that we need to turn and keep our eyes upon Jesus and not all this other stuff. That's the inspiration behind the writing of the song. But here's the sad part. I don't know the song. But actually I do, but I don't. Now that sounds like my grandson, Bo. What I found out, Becky said her mom used to sing her this song all the time. But when it comes to the verse, both of us kind of go, never heard that before in my life. There are a number of contemporary artists who sing this song. Michael W. Smith, Amy Grant, Selah. They sing this song. But if you get online and click Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus, you won't get any of this. So now, let me ask you this. How many songs do you know that the chorus is so powerful that it's a standalone song, but it describes the secret of the strength of our brothers who lived in Smyrna? I know your affliction. I know your poverty. And I know the slanderous things that are said about you. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full on his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his